What kind of place is a public housing anyway? It's probably full of poor people, right?
Well, maybe there aren't many wealthy people living there, I answered, and my sister-in-law let out a characteristic laugh, sharp and high-pitched. Her piercing gaze locked onto me, not letting go. That look of hers was a little crazy, almost dangerous. My name is Nancy. I'm a 24-year-old office worker. I have a fiance who is 12 years older than me. He's a regular, stable company employee named Richard. We met 2 years ago when I was a senior in college. I remember him clearly because he came into the cafe I was working at, carrying a bunch of large shopping bags like he'd just finished running errands. Since I was working part-time to make ends meet, cutting back on leisure, he quickly became familiar with my face too. We exchanged a few words here and there, and as graduation approached, he invited me out to dinner. To be honest, plenty of customers had done the same. But in his case, he came across as very serious, which left a good impression, so I accepted his invitation.
I want you to think about marriage. I'm not saying this because I'm older than you and rushing into it. I want to marry you.
At our first meal together, he proposed right away. I was so caught off guard I couldn't even respond, but he just smiled warmly and said,
I'm sorry to spring this on you, but for me, dating you makes me think about marriage. I'm not unsure or hesitant. I fully intend to accept you as you are. That's all.
His words resonated with me deeply. After spending time together, going on a few more dates and hanging out on weekends, I started to grow fond of him. It took 6 months before I agreed to start officially dating him. But there was still something I hadn't told him. During college, due to financial reasons, I had worked part-time as a hostess at a club in Manhattan. It wasn't something shady, and I wasn't hiding it from anyone. But I hadn't mentioned it because I knew how much he disliked the nightlife industry, and I just couldn't bring myself to say it. Since he said he saw marriage in our future, I decided to come clean about my past work experience.
No way.
One day, we met up for a date, and to my surprise, he brought his mom along. She was quite tall and wearing something flashy. A green skirt with a red shirt covered in black polka dots. She looked just like a watermelon. I thought she was his mom, but he introduced her as his sister. As I looked closer, I realized I knew her. Oh, nice to meet you. I started to say, but she cut me off.
No.
I understood right away. Nice to meet you. I'm Nancy. I looked up at her, pretending it was our first time meeting, and introduced myself. He didn't notice anything and said,
I told my sister first when I started thinking about marriage. She really wanted to meet you.
Nice to meet you. I'm Linda. I've been close with Richard since we were kids. I'm glad we could finally meet today.
His sister's speech was so flat. She sounded like a ventriloquist's dummy, unnatural and robotic. When he went to the bathroom, Linda quickly leaned in and said in a hushed voice,
I don't want my brother or parents to know about my past in the nightlife business. You feel the same, right? So let's keep this between us.
Just then, I saw him coming back, and she instantly put on a big smile. It was hard to keep up with her quick changes. We ended up spending the entire day together, the three of us. Linda linked arms with him and walked off briskly, taking long strides. They were both tall, with long legs, so their steps were large. I'm short and petite, so I had to jog to keep up.
You're so slow, and you're so small and plain in that outfit. I almost lost you in the crowd.
I told them, "Well, this is where I'll leave you too. Enjoy your sibling dinner without me." I was exhausted from trying to keep up with them and just wanted to go home. Plus, with Linda around, I couldn't bring up my hostess job in Manhattan, something she had said she'd keep secret. I decided I'd talk to him about it another time. He seemed a little disappointed when I said I was leaving, but Linda firmly grabbed his arm and waved goodbye with a wide grin. On the train ride home, I couldn't stop thinking about Linda, my sister-in-law-to-be, who I had once worked with at the same club. Linda. Tall, flashy, and always wearing low-cut outfits. I remembered her as a loud and attention-grabbing person. I never expected she'd end up becoming my sister-in-law. It was a bad twist of fate because I knew how mean she could be. About 2 years ago, while working at the club in Manhattan, I came in one day to find the dress the club had given me ripped to shreds. Shocked, I showed it to the madam of the club, but she just handed me a new dress, saying it wasn't uncommon. I had no choice but to wear the replacement, which was a revealing dress with a plunging neckline and open back. A dress that looked almost identical to what Linda was wearing that night. The customers found it hilarious and kept comparing us, saying we were opposites. But the thing that made Linda the most upset was when one of the customers joked that I looked like her daughter and she was my mom. Linda got so worked up over that comment, and after the club closed, she tried to grab me while drunk. Just before things got out of hand, the madam stepped in and stopped her. But what shocked me was what I found out later. It turned out Linda was the one who had slashed my dress. She had tried to mess with me, but it ended up backfiring on her. And she held a grudge against me for it, blaming my presence at the club for her misfortune. After that, I did my best to avoid any contact with her. But the stress of always having to be on guard against her and her nastiness wore me down. Eventually, I quit my hostess job in Manhattan and switched to working at the cafe. And now Linda was going to be my sister-in-law. What's more, she and Richard seemed really close. That night, Richard called me.
Sorry about bringing my sister along all of a sudden today. I wanted to make sure you got home safe, so I'm calling.
I made it back just fine. Sorry I didn't text you. I didn't want to intrude on your sibling time.
Speaking of that, Nancy, did you want to tell me something today?
Yeah? I was touched by how well he understood me, even without me saying much. So I decided to tell him over the phone about my past job in the nightlife business. I kept quiet about Linda, though.
I see. Wow, that's surprising. But you're not doing that kind of work anymore, right?
I reassured him that I'd quit, and he seemed relieved. Then I heard someone talking in the background on his end.
Linda won't take no for an answer. She insists on staying the night.
I was about to ask him not to mention my hostess job to her.
Okay, I'll talk to you later.
He hung up suddenly, and I was left feeling a little uneasy. Not long after that, as I was leaving work, I was stopped by a familiar tall woman. It was Linda. Honestly, I'd been expecting her. She approached me slowly as I turned around.
Let's have a chat.
She grabbed my arm and dragged me to a nearby bar. Linda gave me a hard shove from behind, and I stumbled into the restaurant. I ended up almost falling into the arms of a passing waiter.
Hey, What's with you? Aren't you getting married? And here you are draping yourself all over another guy.
I quickly apologized to the waiter and stepped away from him. The waiter mentioned they were full, but he led us to some seats at the counter.
So, you told Richard about my job in the nightlife business, didn't you?
No, I only told him about myself. I didn't say anything about you.
Don't lie. After he hung up with you, Richard was acting weird. Usually he'd sleep with me, but last night he refused and seemed mad.
Sleep together. I mentally jotted down her shocking comment in my mind. I didn't say anything. Suddenly, Linda started talking about her time as a hostess in Manhattan.
You knew all along, didn't you? About me, the owner, and Morris. Then the madam got involved, and Mindy got mad and started crying to stop it. Andy punched me in the face, and Julia helped me out, but in the end, I was the only one forced to quit.
There were so many people involved that I couldn't keep track and nervously asked Linda, could you explain that again? Apparently, she had been dating both the owner and a customer, Morris, which led to a huge mess. It was like a dramatic soap opera, full of tangled emotions and jealousy, straight out of a soap opera. This is all new to me, but, have you already broken up with both of them?
Not really. Neither of them will let me go. The owner won't let me into the club when I show up, so I dumped trash in front of the entrance the other day. I call Morris several times a day, but when he answers, I can't say anything, so I just hang up.
I didn't know how to respond to her story and decided to give up. I felt like I'd just heard something I was never supposed to hear. Before I knew it, Linda was drinking heavily and soon became so drunk she couldn't stand. I'll call Richard to come pick you up. Just as I tried to call, Linda grabbed my phone and threw it across the room. With no other choice, I got the waiter to help me put her in a cab and headed to the address she gave me. When we arrived, it was just a regular apartment building, but inside, I discovered yet another shocking secret. When we reached her place, the stench hit me. It was a hoarder's nightmare. Suddenly snapping out of her drunken stupor, Linda waved us away. She slammed the door in my face, and the waiter and I exchanged confused glances. Afterward, I wasn't sure how or even if I should tell Richard about what happened with his sister. As I debated, the day of his visit to meet my family for the first time drew closer.
Linda insists on coming along. She says she's taking the place of our parents.
I couldn't say no, so I agreed to let her come.
Excuse me, but didn't you have a hard time raising Nancy?
Linda suddenly asked my mother during the visit.
Yes, after my husband passed away, we discovered he had debts, and we lost our home. My children also had to face financial struggles. But why do you ask?
Linda gave a cruel smile and said,
Well, I don't mean to be rude, but this tiny apartment, these cheap-looking furniture pieces that seem like they cost a few bucks, and the dollar shop cups, it's just obvious you don't have much money, isn't it? Especially if this is all you could manage to host your daughter's future husband.
My mother looked down, ashamed.
I'm sorry.
Seeing my mother apologize made me incredibly sad, and I was about to snap back at Linda when Richard stepped in.
I think this is a very cozy home. I'd much rather live a sensible life than spend money decorating just for show. I'm happy to see Nancy was raised with such values.
His words brought tears to both my mother's and my eyes. Linda glared at the three of us before storming out without saying goodbye. Then it was my turn to visit his parents' house. And sure enough, Linda was there again. I wasn't surprised, given that it was Richard's family home, but after seeing how she treated my mother, I feared she'd try to cause trouble again. After I greeted his parents and Linda, his parents welcomed me warmly.
I can't believe such a young lady is going to be Richard's wife. We're so happy.
Absolutely. She's such a lovely young woman.
Turning away in displeasure at her parents' words, Linda said,
"Don't you think Nancy isn't a good fit for our family? I visited her home the other day, and I heard she struggled financially and even worked in the nightlife industry."
Richard's mother gasped at Linda's words.
Nightlife work. Is that true, Nancy?
Richard's father's expression also changed immediately upon hearing the word nightlife. Just like Richard, it seemed his whole family had a very negative image of that line of work. But what they didn't know was that Linda herself had worked in the nightlife industry. I wondered if they knew about the bullying I experienced, the messy relationships Linda had involving affairs and dating two men at once, or the fact that she lived in a hoarder's apartment and behaved like a stalker. I wonder if his parents know.
You can't even deny it, can you? Then why don't you just leave? Don't come back to this house.
Linda ignored me and smiled sweetly.
Can't find the front door in this big house. Want me to show you the way?
I couldn't take it anymore and finally snapped. Fine, then let's call off the engagement.
What?
Linda looked shocked by my response. After a brief pause, I gathered my courage and said, "The biggest reason I'm worried about marrying Richard is you, Linda."
What are you talking about?
You worked in the nightlife industry too, didn't you?
Richard looked pained as he spoke.
I've heard everything from Nancy. Linda, what have you been doing in New York? Not only working in the nightlife industry, but stalking a guy you met at the club, living in a trash-filled apartment.
Linda, stunned by her brother's words, turned to look at me. I stared back, refusing to look away.
What nightlife work? And what about stalking or living in a messy apartment?
Linda clapped her hands as if she had an epiphany and said,
"Oh, you're talking about Nancy, right? Yeah, I remember her in those skimpy outfits, always showing off her back and chest."
"How do you even know about my outfits?" As I spoke, I quietly placed a few photos on the table. In the photo, there were several hostesses. One of them was Linda, dressed in the revealing outfit she had just described, standing front and center. Her parents looked shocked, too stunned to speak. Linda began to open her mouth, likely to make a poor excuse, when suddenly, we heard someone at the door.
"Nice to meet you. I'm Nancy's brother, Ethan."
It was my younger brother, the waiter from the bar Linda had dragged me to. He revealed that he had overheard everything that night while we were sitting at the counter.
I wouldn't normally eavesdrop, but I was concerned after hearing about my sister's future sister-in-law.
After saying that, my brother, mentioning how I had scolded him later, played the recording of Linda's actual conversation from that night. Hearing it, her mother shouted in anger,
Linda, what on earth are you doing? Back in New York, wearing outfits like that again, practically naked.
Her mother, in tears, demanded answers, repeatedly asking why. I started to feel anxious, but Richard reassured me by squeezing my hand tightly. Linda, overwhelmed by her mother's tears, began crying as well. Her father sat silently, hands clenched, looking down.
Linda, It's time to leave New York behind and move back here.
Realizing that her family now knew everything, Linda nodded in agreement. Later, I heard that her father had gone to help clean up her apartment, and together, over the course of several days, they finally tidied the place. I offered to help as well.
Let Dad handle it. In a way, it's part of making amends.
The reason Richard and his family despise the nightlife industry is because his father once had an affair with a woman who worked in that field. It almost tore the family apart, leaving deep emotional scars. Later, Richard told me that his sister, who had moved to New York with him, unknowingly ended up working in the same industry. Not only that, but she had been tricked and hurt by one of her male customers. I was surprised to learn that Linda's strange behavior wasn't something new.
Linda's too lonely to handle a place like New York. I'm just grateful I met you, Nancy, because it helped me realize what was happening to her. Thank you.
I asked him something that had been on my mind for a while. Linda mentioned, when she dragged me to that bar where my brother works, that she sleeps in the same bed as you. Is that true? He burst out laughing and said,
Of course not. That's just one of her lonely daydreams. No way.
A while later, I learned that Linda had left New York and returned to her hometown with her father after cleaning out her apartment. With her now out of the picture, I felt relieved that the one thing troubling me about our marriage was finally resolved. We decided to have our wedding near Richard's family home. I'm really looking forward to seeing the joy on everyone's faces on our big day.